Okay, well, my name is Francis, middle initial Stevens, middle name Stevenson after my mother's family name, and last name Riley. In St. Luke's Hospital in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where my dad was a reasonably recently established English professor at Lehigh University. My very earliest days returning from my hospital of birth were spent in the former mansion of the president of, I think it was the Lehigh Valley Railroad, who founded the railroad. And his name was Robert Sayre. And he left a beautiful mansion which was converted into apartments, and that was my first home. It was convenient for my dad because it was only about 4 blocks from the university. Well, I had a daughter. I don't mean daughter. I had a sister who was almost exactly 2 years younger than me, but she unfortunately died a few years ago. Her name was Elizabeth Spencer Riley. My dad was a professor of English at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. My mother was head of the Latin department initially at the Moravian Seminary, the Moravian Preparatory School, and eventually the Baldwin School for Girls. I was introduced to the pleasure of reading before I could do it by the fact that my mother would read to us out of classical storybooks, Tom Sawyer and that sort of thing. My mother would read to us every night at bedtime. After we were settled into bed, we had a 15 or 20 minute period of my mother reading aloud to us. And that, I think, was very instructive in terms of getting us an appreciation for intellectual and academic capabilities. But I do remember my grandfather a little bit, although he passed when I was quite young. But my father's sister, after whom I was named, because her name was Frances, and her aunt occupied the first house that was ready for occupancy when Rehoboth was established. It's still in good shape on Virginia Avenue, but it's not in the family anymore. It's 18 Virginia Avenue, and it's a nice house. It was built by my grandfather. My most vivid memory is that my father's sister, after whom I was named, Frances, told a story about standing in the second floor window of the north side of the house and looking up the beach before the hotel hadn't opened up, totally blocked that view, and looking at the lighthouse up in on the dunes at Cape Henlopen, the historic lighthouse, and thinking what a pity it was that it was recognized that this lighthouse was doomed by erosion if somebody didn't do something about it. And nobody had the money and the willingness to put into it. She looked out the window and thought about this, glanced away, looked back, and it was gone. She didn't actually see it topple, but within a matter of seconds, she saw that it was gone. Can you imagine the shock of that? Went to the beach and splashed in the ocean. Oh, and we used to go crabbing in the yacht basin quite often. Bring home a bushel basket full of blue crabs, spend hours cleaning them all, and enjoy a wonderful crab dinner. I didn't do any fishing in the old days, but I did in my later adult years. I got into surf fishing and enjoyed it. But one of my treasured memories is the sailing that we did on Rehoboth Bay. My father was a skillful sailor, and also, this is irrelevant, but also I happen to think about it, a skillful ice skater. And so he went sailing in the summertime and ice skating when he was at Cornell in the wintertime. But anyway, there was a gentleman named Dan Simpler, who had a rental sailboat business in the northeast corner of Rehoboth Bay. And he also had he founded the Bottle and Cork Inn, which was located at on the shore there at the base of a pier that he had built for his rental sailboats. And that was a great experience for me as a youngster to learn how to handle a sailboat. Every day there was a vendor that would come by, either on a bicycle or pushing a cart or something with fresh fruit, whatever was current, And let's see, what was the? I'm sorry, I can't think of it right now. But he had a kind of a chant that he uttered in a very loud voice. He was very impressive, and he'd push this cart full of all kinds of veggies and whatnot. He'd push it up Columbia Avenue singing this song to attract attention. That was how he got people interested in coming out to see what he had to sell that day. Well, it was a treasured destination. It took a good breeze, preferably a south wind, to get out there from the Dewey Beach harbor. But there were some little coves where you could land and feel reasonably comfortable doing so. Although I don't think Dan Simpler would have been happy if he'd known about it. But anyway, we used to do it, and the pine trees were beautiful. And after being away from here for some years, after I graduated from Lehigh and was living in California, and I finally was able to get back here and went out to Rehoboth Bay, and Piney Island had disappeared. And I asked somebody about it, and they said, well, a bunch of kids used to go out there on Saturday night and have orgies of one sort or another, and they'd build a big bonfire, and the bonfire got out of control, burned down all the pine trees and vegetation on the island, and the island was eroded by just the natural function of the bay waters after all the vegetation was burned off. So it's a real shame. The families that I was close to were the Goodrich family over on the Acres, and Charlie Goodrich was one of my closest friends. And we would take their boats or whatever and go up and down the canal and out to the bay and all that. And of course the Hughes family across the street, John Hughes' older siblings. Winky, I don't know what his real name was, but he was Winky as far as anybody knew. And his younger brother Michael and his younger sister Genevieve. And they were, a good fun bunch of kids. They had a nice house over there. We'd have parties over in their house, parties in the cottage, our rental cottage next door when it wasn't occupied. Mm-hmm. Well, there was an A&P on Rehoboth Avenue, just inland from First Street, and there was an American store, I think next door. And there was a lovely girl who was a cashier at the American store. And so we had a very nice summer together one year. Well, the milk was delivered and the ice was delivered because in those days we didn't have electric refrigerators. The iceman would come up the street and push a cart with big blocks of ice, and it got serviced. It worked. Well, of course, the war was a major influence, and I was amazed to come down here and discover that, for example, the CAP. Are you familiar with the CAP?
Civil Air Patrol.
Right, and they had. I think the DuPonts were very influential in all of this, but in any event. They would send a patrol out at dawn every morning at treetop level, and that that woke me up every morning. And then the CAP patrol planes would be out over the ocean not very far offshore, a few miles. You know, you could typically see them. I don't know how far off they got, but they were visible a lot because the early morning patrols would run low on fuel and come home, and then the next patrol would go out, and so on and so on. And I have one vivid recollection of the war years, and that was going in the ocean one day and hearing this click, 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 click. And I thought, what the hell was that? And I get my head out of the water. I couldn't hear anything. I get my head underwater, and I hear this obvious sound of a motor or a pump or a propeller or something. I walked all up and down the beach looking for somebody pumping water. Nothing anywhere on the beach within half a mile of north and south of Deauville Beach would account for that noise. So later in the afternoon, I was walking up the beach, and a squadron of Navy dive bombers comes over, and they start diving probably, I don't know, a mile and a half offshore possibly, and dropping depth charges. And then a destroyer or a destroyer escort came charging from who knows where, and dropping depth charges and so on. And later in the day, a slick of very odd-looking red oil washed ashore and left a marker on the high tide line. And I had never seen, red oil. And I've never heard about this from anybody, but I'm pretty sure that they either severely damaged or sunk a U-boat within probably a mile or two or three between here and Cape May. And I would not be at all surprised if some energetic individual could find the wreckage out there. We had the so-called, it wasn't really a blackout, I've forgotten what they called it, it was a modified term, but the houses that were close to the beach line were really dark. And all of us back here had to keep blackout shades on any light that was going to shine out in the streets to any significant degree. All the street lights had a metal cone around the bulb, so all the light that they emitted was simply a circle of light on the pavement below. And you could stand, 100 feet away and not even know that there was a light there because it was totally shielded by this cone. And the idea was that, the U-boats took advantage of the fact that if this sort of thing wasn't rigorously performed, there was a bright light that silhouetted the ships that were unlighted and trying to, hide almost in nightfall as they came up the coastline. So when they were silhouetted against town lights, they were an easy target. Well, I don't know much about that. I know that my father's grandmother was responsible for building what was supposedly the first house that was ready for occupancy up at 18 Virginia Avenue. But her son, one of her sons, my Uncle Ed, my father's Uncle Ed, bought up this city block here. And I think his brother, William Herman Riley, my father's father, bought up a chunk of the block west of here, on the other side of 3rd Street. But that was all totally undeveloped when I was a youngster. So that was my woodlands. And I'd go out there with my BB gun and pretend I was Daniel Boone or somebody. Well, what I'm certain of is that my father's uncle, Uncle Ed as he was known, built this house, the house catty-cornered back on Henlopen Avenue, and the house next one up on Columbia Avenue, so-called Pine Lodge. And those houses were all in the family when I was growing up. And at one time or another, we stayed in, probably in all three of them, but mostly here, or when this was rented for the season, we'd occupy what was known as Pine Lodge, which is the next house east of here on Columbia Avenue. And what was in those days was the carriage house, and the maid's quarters for Pine Lodge, the next house east, is now the basis of a considerable skyscraper out there. It's like, I don't know what it is, maybe a 5-story building that's out here is quite tall and handsome. But the original part of it, the old garage, is still there. It's kind of I think it's been turned into the kitchen area or something. I'm not sure quite what it is, but it's still there. I want them to remember their grandparents and other family relations that were very active down here during the summertime. And I haven't really thought about that, but I'm sure that over the years they have formed a lot of cherished memories. For many years, when I was living with my family on the West Coast or in Colorado, I had a small airplane and I would fly the family back here for whatever vacation we had. Sometimes it was we'd send the kids back on a commercial airliner and then come a month or so later when I could get vacation for a little while and have a vacation time for a week or two together, and then we'd all get in my little airplane and fly back home to Colorado or California or wherever it was. Well, it was a grass strip. It was never paved, but it was a well-maintained grass strip. It was widely used by crop dusters, but more importantly, during the war, it was the base for the CAP patrol planes that went out every morning at dawn, and it was I think a significant and important aspect of the neighborhood. I was very disappointed when they closed it down, but I remember some air shows that were held out there, and parachute jumping, and also that was where they, in those days, the commercial pilots that nowadays are towing banners around town, they would pick up their banners there. And the banners would be lying on the ground with a sort of something like a football, what do you call the...
goalposts?
Goalposts, the football goalposts, with a string between the two posts. And the plane would come down with a cable hanging out the back and a hook, like a triple anchor hanging from it. And the anchor would grab the cable across these goalposts, and that would jerk the, the banner off the ground, and away they'd go. You know? I think basically mostly going to the beach and having really joyful family big dinners and that sort of thing. You know, we come home from in most of my younger years, it was traditional to have the big family meal of the day somewhere along about 2 o'clock, 1:30, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So we'd go down to the beach 10:30, 11 o'clock, come back somewhat late to go through the shower and all that business, and then we have a nice big meal and a very late supper after it got dark. But that was the tradition. One of my father's friends, well, maybe it was my dad, I'm not really sure, but they cooked up the name because we often had guests down here, and the house would be really full, like two full families living in this house, and with kids off on a porch somewhere or whatever. And so in order to feed the crew, we'd often have 2 chickens for dinner. And someone of our guests, I've forgotten who it was, named the house TWYNN Chickens, twin chickens, because we so often had 2 chickens for dinner. Mary Lockerman most of the time. Does that name mean anything to you? The name not Lockerman may mean something. There's a street in, where is it, Dover? Lockerman Street. And her family went back a long time. But she was somehow or another, I think, put out for adoption when she was a baby. And in any event, she grew up under somewhat stressful, I think, circumstances, living in the house of, I think, a minister whose name I've forgotten, over in Seaford. And then she came down here as a practical nurse to take care of my father's ancestors who were getting elderly and needed, needed somebody to look after them and do housework and that sort of thing. So she became essentially a member of our family. And there was a year, for example, when my father had an exchange professorship with a professor of English at University of Wyoming in Laramie. So we exchanged jobs and houses. We lived in their house in Laramie, and they lived in our house in Bethlehem. And Mary Locker went with us on that trip, and she was famous for complaining about the some of the ways that my dad would drive and so on. But she was good about it. She was good about it. And my sister, who was young at the time, I've forgotten exactly what our ages were, but I think she was probably around 5 or so, and I was 7. And my mother amused us by making up little songs and ditties and whatnot while we were, taking these long daily tours to get from the West Coast or the East Coast out to Wyoming, Colorado, and so on. And one of them was, Aunt Mamie got up on a chilly morn and looked pie-eyed and stewed. She hobbled around and grumbled and frowned and said, "It's the altitude." She was my grandfather's sister, and she was I think, really talented artist. I mean, that's her work. And she never married for whatever reasons I don't know. But anyway, she and her niece, my father's sister, and at times Mary Molineux, does that name mean anything to you? They were a trio, as it were, and they traveled a lot together. And Mary Molineux came to our house with them at Christmas every year. And she was a great favorite of mine. I thought she was wonderful. But, well, that's what comes into mind, right away. My family initiated the custom of, tradition of a big family gathering at Christmas time in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So my father's sister and his aunt, and my mother's sister, et cetera, we'd all converge on the property in Bethlehem. And of course, Bethlehem was noted at the time for its lighting, its Christmas lighting, because the name obviously gave it a good reason. So it was, it was jolly. Well, I guess the biggest change is what's going on out on the other side of the canal, the big shopping centers out there and so on. When I was a teenager, I used to do the family shopping on my bicycle over here at the A&P at the American store on Rehoboth Avenue, and Lingo's on First Street, on the corner there. So the biggest changes obviously have taken place outside of the town limits, thank God. But anyway, it's the development in the Hanover Acres and North Shores has, of course, been very striking and is very attractive by and large. I think Hanover Acres is one of the most beautiful neighborhoods I've ever seen anywhere. What we used to call West Rehoboth, or was it? No, South Rehoboth. We used to be known as South Rehoboth. Out around Silver Lake and whatnot, there's a lot of nice development out there. Well, I don't know that I have any particular advice to give except enjoy it. Be active, participate,
That's
and
wonderful.
Develop interests outside of your local television set.